Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and after the announcement at CES last week, today we can present our review of the brand new Nvidia RTX 4070 Super. Spoiler alert, it is pretty decent as refreshes go, but of course we've got plenty of details to get into, so let's dive in. If you missed the announcement at last week's Nvidia CES 2024 keynote, it is definitely worth quickly recapping the core specs so you know exactly what it is we are looking at with the brand new RTX 4070 Super. Essentially, Nvidia has taken the original 4070 and bumped up the core count from 5,888 CUDA cores up to 7,168, so it's actually now a lot closer to the 4070 Ti. Tensor cores, RT cores, texture units and ROPs all see an increase as well. What hasn't changed though is the core memory subsystem, so we still find 12GB of GDDR6X memory operating over a 192-bit bus, giving total memory bandwidth of 504GB a second. The only small tweak here is a now larger L2 cache up to the same 48MB size of the 4070 Ti. Naturally, power draw has also increased over the 4070 considering the extra cores on offer, with a new TGP of 220 watts. All of that comes in at the same price as the original 4070 as well, with the 4070 Super launching at £579 or $599 US, so on paper it certainly sounds like a decent refresh. It is now time to put the card to the test however, and for this we are using our regular GPU test system which is provided to us by PC Specialist. This is built on Intel's i9-3900KS CPU paired with the Gigabyte Z790 Gaming X AX motherboard, and we've also got 32GB of Corsair Dominator Platinum DDR5 memory. All the data you're going to see in this video as well has been collected from Fresh over the last couple of weeks using the latest drivers and the latest game updates. The only thing I would say is that while I did test 12 games as normal, I'm not going to go through the results of every single one in this video for reasons that will quickly become clear. However, if you do want to see the results for all 12 games tested at 1080p, 1440p and 4K, then you can do so at your own leisure in the written article, which is over at kitguru.net, and I will leave a link down in the description. Kicking off the game benchmarks then, our first game of the day is actually a new one for our test suite. It's Alan Wake 2, and it is quite a tough test, even at 1440p. The RTX 4070 Super averages 58 FPS, making it just 5% slower than the RTX 4070 Ti, or 18% faster than the vanilla 4070. 4K is unfortunately just too demanding for this class of GPU without some form of upscaling, as the 4070 Super barely exceeds 30 FPS, though it is still a lot closer to the 4070 Ti than it is to the original 4070. Assassin's Creed Mirage does run noticeably faster, and at 1440p the 4070 Super is capable of just under 110 FPS. Again, that makes it just 5% slower than the RTX 4070 Ti, though AMD actually does pretty well in this game, and the 4070 Super is only 4% ahead of the RX 7800 XT. Stepping up to 4K, we still get a very playable 60 FPS experience, with the 4070 Super holding a 13% lead over the non-Super RTX 4070, and it's also now 6% faster than the 7800 XT. Moving on then to Cyberpunk 2077 with the latest 2.1 update. This sees the 4070 Super come out neck and neck with the RX 7800 XT at 1440p, but we are looking at an 18% gain over the vanilla 4070, and again just a 5% deficit compared to the 4070 Ti. Performance scaling is much the same up at 4K too. Granted, you will likely want to enable DLSS in this game as 38 FPS isn't super smooth, but coming in just 6% behind the 4070 Ti is a very good result considering the price differential. A Plague Tale Requiem is up next, and this is one of the more demanding games we test. At 1440p, the RTX 4070 Super is capable of 74 FPS, and again that makes it 16% faster than the 4070, 9% slower than the 4070 Ti, but actually 13% ahead of the RX 7800 XT. Up at 4K, the 4070 Super does drop off a touch relative to the 7800 XT, as it's now just 7% faster compared to its 13% lead at 1440p. We can put this down to the fact that it still shares the same relatively narrow 192-bit memory interface as the 4070 and the 4070 Ti, so performance does tend to drop off slightly at higher resolutions. Moving on then to Resident Evil 4, this is one of the most performant games we test, and at 1440p, using maximum settings with the exclusion of ray tracing, the 4070 Super delivers almost 120 FPS, putting it 16% ahead of the 4070, while it's 8% slower than the 4070 Ti. As we increase the resolution up to 4K, we also see the exact same margins. The only other noteworthy point is that this is the only game where we saw the 4070 Super come in slower than the RX 7800 XT at 4K, admittedly by just a 5% margin, but that does still make it noteworthy. Starfield is another new game to join our test suite, and boy is it demanding in our chosen benchmark area in the forests on Jemison. At 1440p, the 4070 Super manages just 51 FPS, though that does still make it 17% faster than the 4070, and it's about level with the RX 7800 XT. As for 4K, the 1% lows do drop below 30 FPS here, so you will want to enable some form of upscaling, though again, we're looking at a 16% uplift versus the vanilla 4070, while the 4070 Super is 8% behind the 4070 Ti. Lastly then, we close out with Total War Pharaoh. This one sees the 4070 Super hit 109 FPS at 1440p, where it's only 10% slower than AMD's RX 7900 XT, and that puts it just 5% behind the 4070 Ti. Likewise, at 4K, we can see the 4070 Super delivering a 15% lead over the original 4070, so it's only 5% slower again than the 4070 Ti, but it's actually over 20% faster than AMD's 7800 XT. That's where I'm going to leave the individual benchmarks for this video, as the trends do become clear pretty quickly. But again, as a reminder, if you do want to see the benchmarks for all 12 games we tested over 3 resolutions, you can check out the written article on kitguru.net. Now, however, we will look at the 12 game average results, and these are pretty much what we expected given the specs. The 4070 Super slots between the original 4070 and the 4070 Ti, though it is much closer to the latter GPU than it is to the former. That's because at 1440p it is on average 15% faster than the 4070, but just 6% slower than the 4070 Ti. That also makes it 8% faster than the 7800 XT, it's 13% ahead of the RTX 3080 10GB, but still 18% slower than AMD's RX 7900 XT. 4K gaming isn't out of the question either, where the 4070 Super is still 16% faster than the 4070 and now 7% slower than the 4070 Ti. It's also 7% faster than the 7800 XT and still 10% ahead of the RTX 3080 10GB. As for what that means in terms of cost per frame using the launch MSRP pricing, a circa 15% performance uplift for effectively the same price as the original RTX 4070, it's actually £10 less for UK buyers. That does mean the cost per frame of the 4070 Super has improved a fair bit. It now represents a 15% reduction in cost per frame versus the 4070 when looking at the 1440p data, and it also closes the gap on the 7800 XT quite significantly, though it isn't able to fully catch up with the AMD GPU. Of course, current retail pricing can vary quite a bit compared to the launch MSRPs, but even then, if the 4070 Super can come to market at the £579 asking price, its value is still going to be very competitive. It is also worth pointing out that in many cases, the 7800 XT's value won't be as good as what's shown here, as it has been selling above MSRP quite consistently since its launch, and only in the last week or so did I see a reference model drop back to the £480 MSRP. Moving on though to talk about ray tracing performance, we're going to start off with Alan Wake 2. Using the RT High preset here does engage path tracing, which is hugely demanding, so we have enabled FSR quality mode for all GPUs. Even then, at 1440p, the 4070 Super is only capable of 37 FPS using these settings, though that does still make it 17% faster than the RTX 4070 and 7% slower than the 4070 Ti. Compared to AMD's offerings, Nvidia GPUs are just in a completely different class. Avatar Frontiers of Pandora is another new game today that has ray tracing baked in to the core of the engine. The 4070 Super delivers 57 FPS at 1440p, and again that's a typical 16% uplift versus the RTX 4070. It's also 35% faster than the 7800 XT and only a handful of frames slower than the 7900 XT. Moving on though, it's time for Cyberpunk 2077, and we're using the RT Ultra preset here, not the path traced RT Overdrive mode, but it is still very punishing, bringing the 4070 Super to just 43 FPS on average without any form of upscaling. That still makes it faster than even AMD's flagship RX 7900 XTX however, and it's the usual 17% faster than the RTX 4070. As for F123, this is much more competitive for AMD GPUs, but even then we're still looking at the 4070 Super coming in 25% faster than the 7800 XT at 1440p, while it's only 8% slower than the 7900 XT. Versus the 4070 Ti as well, it's also 9% slower. Ratchet and Clank is up next, and with ray tracing maxed out in this game, AMD GPUs absolutely crumble. At 1440p for instance, the RTX 4070 Super is again faster than AMD's flagship 7900 XTX, but this time by a 29% margin. Compared to the RX 7800 XT, we're talking about almost a doubling of the frame rate for the 4070 Super. Lastly though, we're going to finish up with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Despite being one of the first ray trace games to hit the market back in 2019, while only featuring ray trace shadows, we still see a clear lead for Nvidia hardware in this title. The 4070 Super is 43% faster than the 7800 XT at 1440p for instance, while it's actually again within touching distance of the RX 7900 XTX. Again, I did actually test more games with ray tracing enabled, but I'm actually going to skip ahead to the 8 game average frame rate as the trends are again pretty clear to see. Overall, for ray tracing it is clear that Nvidia hardware does have the edge. We can see that in the average results at 1440p, where the 4070 Super comes in 47% faster than the RX 7800 XT, it's 8% ahead of the RX 7900 XT, and only 5% slower on average compared to the much more expensive 7900 XTX. Relative to Nvidia's own offerings as well, we again see pretty typical results, with the 4070 Super coming in 17% faster than the 4070 and 8% slower than the 4070 Ti. Changing gears now though, it's time to take a closer look at the Nvidia Founders Edition card itself before we assess thermals and noise levels. You likely already saw some of the images or renders online, but the core design of this graphics card is identical to the original 4070. This time around though, Nvidia has gone for a blacked out approach with a darker metal alloy used for the frame, and I have to say, I think it looks very sleek and stealthy, though it's fair to say not everyone in our Discord server agrees with me, so if you do want to weigh in on that, join via the link in our description. The change is entirely aesthetic though. We're told that the internal heatsink is exactly the same, and it's the exact same dimensions as the original 4070, measuring 244 by 112mm while being just 2 slots thick. It also weighed in at just over 1 kilogram on my scales. Power is of course delivered by a single 12V high power connector or PCIe Gen 5 connector, though a dual 8-pin adapter is included. We also get the exact same display outputs with 3 DisplayPort 1.4 and 1 HDMI 2.1. As for how the cooler performs, we're not yet allowed to share comparison data of the 2 RTX 4070 Super custom cards we have tested, as they are OC models. Instead, those reviews will drop tomorrow on January the 17th. For now, we've just used the vanilla RTX 4070 Founders Edition as a point of reference, and given both cards do use this same cooler and heatsink design, it's not a surprise to see similar thermal performance between the 4070 and 4070 Super. The Super does actually run a couple of degrees hotter, though I do think that's to be expected considering it has a higher core count and therefore higher power demands. Likewise, GDDR6 memory temperatures peak just 2 degrees hotter on the 4070 Super, but that is still well within safe limits. As for noise levels, these are as impressive as we have come to expect from Nvidia's Founders Edition designs. We saw the fans run at 1640 RPM under load, which is a small increase over the 1560 RPM speed we observed from the vanilla 4070. It was enough of a difference for our sound meter to detect a small increase in noise, but subjectively speaking, they are both very quiet graphics cards, and I also didn't notice any coil whine. Moving on to our power draw testing though, as a reminder, here we do use Nvidia's PCAT tool to measure power draw of the graphics card only over all 12 games we test at 1080p, 1440p and 4K resolution, so we can be pretty precise with our data. Now, I'm not going to go over the results from all 12 games we tested, otherwise we'd be here for hours, so if you do want to see that data, head to the written article on kitguru.net. Instead here, I'm going to take a look at the average results for 1440p gaming. As we can see then, the RTX 4070 Super continues the 40 series tradition of drawing less power than its rated TGP, averaging 210.6 watts power draw over the 12 games we tested. That puts it about 10 watts below the 220 watt TGP, and it marks an increase of about 17 watts compared to the vanilla RTX 4070. Some games do draw more than this figure, such as Alan Wake 2 and Cyberpunk 2077, but plenty of games also saw power draw below 200 watts. As for what that power draw means then in terms of overall efficiency, average performance per watt has actually increased by 5% compared to the vanilla RTX 4070. The RTX 4080 does remain the most efficient GPU we've tested so far, but compared to RDNA 3, there is still a clear lead for Nvidia's Ada architecture on show. For instance, the 4070 Super is 19% more efficient than both of AMD's RX 7900 XT and 7900 XTX graphics cards. Lastly then, a quick word on overclocking. The Nvidia Founders Edition card actually has a maximum power limit of 240 watts, so you can increase the power slider up to 109%. Maxing that out, I was able to add 210 MHz to the GPU core and 1280 MHz to the memory. This resulted in a real-world clock speed of just under 2,930 MHz, and that was measured over a 30-minute stress test in Cyberpunk 2077. This overclock then saw our frame rates increase on average by between 5 to 9%, depending on the games we tested. It's reasonable, nothing too crazy, but about what we've come to expect from Ada Lovelace. It did, however, result in a small increase to power draw, up from 226 watts stock to 238 watts, as measured in Cyberpunk. That's only a 5% increase though, so really nothing to worry about. All in all, the RTX 4070 Super is a pretty easy graphics card to sum up. Essentially, Nvidia has taken the original 4070, bumped up the core count by 22% and delivered it at the same £580 asking price. That means we're getting about 15% extra gaming performance for the same money, improving cost per frame by a similar margin, while efficiency is also increased. Now, is it a revolution in graphics performance? Well, no, but it's also not trying to be. It's a simple refresh design just to keep interest going in the RTX 40 series, and I think it's definitely achieved that goal. The one thing I would say is that this refresh hasn't addressed my main criticism of the original 4070, that being the 12GB frame buffer, as there's no doubt 16 gigs would be preferable at this price point. 12 gigs of VRAM I think is okay for now, but it will be interesting to see how that situation develops over the next couple of years. My gut feeling is that a 12GB card today will have more longevity than an 8GB card released back in 2020, but we are just going to have to wait and see how that one plays out. It's also fair to point out that AMD's RX 7800 XT is still a viable option, particularly if your main focus is on bang for buck, as that GPU actually offers the best cost per frame for 1440p rasterized gaming, and of course it does have 4 gigs of extra VRAM. If you were on the fence about which GPU to buy though, I do think the 4070 Super is likely to appeal to a large number of people, considering it is faster outright than the 7800 XT, significantly so when it comes to ray tracing, while also offering support for the superior DLSS upscaling technology, and is more efficient too. No matter what your priorities are though, it's clear the RTX 4070 Super is a step in the right direction, and we sincerely hope this is a sign of things to come. Anyway guys, that is where I'm going to leave this video. So if you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Please do subscribe if you haven't already, and ding that notification bell so you won't miss when we upload a new video. And if you want to carry on the conversation, why not head over to our Discord server, which is linked in the description. While you're there, you can also find a link to our merch store where you can consider picking up a brand new t-shirt. And finally, if you're feeling particularly generous, you could even consider backing us on Patreon. That's it for this one though guys. I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.